the evidence suggests that people who've already decided to vote Reform are partly doing so because they have absolutely no time for the mainstream parties. So the idea that people who are committed to Reform will come back to Labour, I think, is slightly for the birds. A lot of people are concerned about small votes. That's very different to the question of how many people are getting visas to come and work here. But it all gets bundled together in a lot of lazy public debate that doesn't sort of separate out these various strands. Now, what you can do about small votes is very different to what you can do about visas.
Hello, Professor.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing very, very well. Thank you for agreeing to join in this podcast and contribute your expertise. Today, I'm hoping to discuss a few things, mainly around public relations, political psychology. Myself, I'm a marketer, and around public perception. But I think the very key thing for viewers at home to understand here is we have a new Labour government. Well, not new, but, it's been 1 year or so, newish. And much of the political oxygen is being consumed by Nigel Farage and Reform. Mm-hmm. From a sort of public perception standpoint, how would you define the nature of this threat? So much air is being consumed by Farage.
Well, I mean, there are lots of reasons. I mean, there is the fact that they basically did pretty well in recent local elections. So the most recent actual elections we've had, Reform came out. I mean, you could say they came out as the winners. They're polling ahead of the other parties. So there's a legitimate reason to be interested in them. Whether they are the major threat to Labour, I think, is something that's open to discussion. And of course, what you shouldn't forget is that Nigel Farage is just a very, very good communicator in an era when actually there are very few good political communicators in our politics.
Yeah, so, there is still debate as whether Reform is actually the main opposition to Labour right now, or, whether they should actually be that worried and whether they should be putting the spotlight on them and trying to combat their claims.
Absolutely. I mean, what I would say is, a lot of conclusions were drawn from those local elections, but midterm elections are a notoriously bad guide to general election voting behaviour for several reasons. I mean, one, you only get an incomplete picture of the country. So there's only a snapshot of some parts of the country you got in May. Two, turnout is very, very low. And three, people tend to use local elections to cast judgment on the incumbent government, not to choose between that government and some alternative. So I think there are reasons to be cautious.
Okay. And so a bit like European elections back in when we were still part of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, the big difference with European elections, of course, was that we eventually came around to using a system of PR for those, and that made it a lot easier. I mean, traditionally, Nigel Farage's parties, if you go back to UKIP in 2015 is the clearest example, they've been hamstrung by the fact that even if they rose in popularity, their vote was evenly spread throughout the country. So off the top of my head, and these numbers aren't 100% accurate, I think in 2015, UKIP got almost 4 million votes, but only got one MP. From memory, I think the SNP got just over 2 million votes, but got 50-something MPs because their vote was concentrated in Scotland. So PR made life a lot easier for Nigel. I mean, one of the paradoxes, one of the many paradoxes around Brexit is that not only were European elections very good for Nigel Farage's party because of PR, but the European Union was very good for Nigel Farage's party because the bulk of their funding came from having MEPs in the European Parliament.
That's quite a irony there. So, you've studied Brexit comprehensively and very extensively. How much of the current energy around Reform is just baggage and cleavage from Brexit, or is it, a completely new territory?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the success of Nigel Farage when it came to Brexit was in the fact that he managed to link an issue about which the public was becoming increasingly concerned, immigration, with an issue about which the public really didn't care at all prior to the referendum, Brexit. So immigration, I think, was what got him, is what made the Brexit cause work. So in that sense, Reform UK are still talking a lot about immigration. There's very little to be said about Brexit. The local election campaign, perhaps understandably in a local election campaign, it doesn't come up. So he's reverted back to what was the original issue, which was immigration. Plus, because they're becoming a more serious party now, trying to develop policies in other areas as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of, as you said, a lot of Farage's appeal comes from his quite good communication, and just analysing it as someone who's in the field of marketing and public perception. He does stand out among politicians. There are many other good communicators, but he's managed to do something which we haven't seen in the UK for a while, really, I think, since perhaps maybe even Tony Blair. Of course, it's not on that level yet, but, the media often says Reform is quite angry, Farage is quite angry. To what extent is it just a matter of anger, populism, or is it more a sense of cultural loss or loss of national identity, or being patronised by the media and by, what Reform calls the establishment or the big parties, being patronised by them? Or is it anger, or is it just a real sense of loss for their sympathisers, perhaps?
I mean, there are lots of different things. There are certainly people who feel culturally threatened, and Reform appeal to those. There is, across the Western world, a sort of sense of anti-politics, which is that politicians can't deliver. I mean, this is in the context of, getting on to 20 years now in this country where we haven't seen significant levels of growth. We haven't seen median incomes rise. We've been through the great financial crisis, followed by austerity, followed by Brexit, followed by COVID, followed by cost of living crisis, followed by the war in Ukraine. So we've been buffeted by economic crises one after the other. So in that sense, it's not surprising that more and more voters are thinking politics are failing us. They're not giving us the growth we've become accustomed to. There is no reason to expect my kids to be better off than I am. So there are lots of good practical reasons, I think, why people are getting fed up of politics. And of course, one of the worrying things about politics across the Western world at the moment is the tendency for people to vote against things rather than to vote for things.
Mm. So
you saw that very strongly, in the 2024 election, where there's very good evidence that the Labour majority that was secured at that election was secured because of opposition to the Tories rather than because of any great affection for the Labour Party.
Yeah, you just covered on the ground of, economic anxiety almost. In order to, I think, understand what Starmer should perhaps do to combat this rise and what other mainstream parties should do, I think we need to first understand what a Reform voter, what's important for them, and why they've become, as you said, so disillusioned with especially Western politics. And what would you say is almost the emotional hierarchy? Is it economy? Is it, the mainstream parties being very almost not connecting with voters? Is it a combination, really?
Well, the biggest single issue for the majority of Reform voters is immigration. I think the polling makes that clear. I mean, it's very, very interesting that one of the problems that Keir Starmer faces is that immigration really isn't an issue for Labour voters. So majoring on immigration, I think it's problematic, partly because the evidence suggests that people who've already decided to vote Reform are partly doing so because they have absolutely no time for the mainstream parties. So the idea that people who are committed to Reform will come back to Labour, I think, is slightly for the birds.
Okay.
And I think, there is a sense of disillusion among Reform voters in the same way that there is among Green voters. I mean, one of the reasons why people are willing to experiment, one of the reasons why, we've now got the weird situation of a first-past-the-post system operating with five-party marginals, is because of a sense that the big two parties don't have solutions to the problems we face. And I think in that sense, one of the interesting things about 2024 was that it was the lowest ever combined vote share recorded by the Conservatives and Labour.
Yeah, I think there's just, I think, as you said, there's almost been a divestment of votes because of the failure of politics. So is there any merit in his personal brand? Could Labour perhaps use the sort of personal brand of Farage to sort of gain back votes? You just said that, perhaps it's, the Reform voters won't come to Labour. But of course, we have seen a massive leave as you said, there's been a massive reduction in the votes for mainstream parties. So how can mainstream parties get them back, really? Is it?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer for the Labour Party is to show some improvement in the economy and particularly in public services. I mean, they've got 3.5, 4 years now in which to try and get, waiting lists down in the NHS. That sense of a broken Britain that was so pervasive pre-2024, Labour need to show that they have made significant progress in dealing with that. And of course, it's a very, very difficult situation to do it because, they have the combination of failing public services and a very poor economic situation. If you think about when Tony Blair came to power, the economy was doing pretty well. So Labour had money to invest in public services. If you think about when David Cameron came into power in 2010, the economy was suffering because of the great financial crisis, but public services were actually in pretty good shape because of the new Labour years. Keir Starmer is confronting both problems at once in a context where the government at least have made a straitjacket for themselves with their fiscal rules, which means that borrowing more money isn't possible. So how you fix public services in a time of straitened public finances is a massive dilemma.
That's very interesting because I've been speaking to a lot of people about this, and some have said this messaging, and I think it's very key, the whole policy aspect of this, and trying to show a genuine improvement in the economy, and trying to, maybe the only way to win back disillusionment is to show illuminate success.
Yeah.
But I was talking with my co-host about this, and he told me that reforms conversation, it feels a bit like you're in the pub, really. It feels like you're having a conversation with a mate at the pub, whereas Labour feels a bit like a PowerPoint. So if Labour do manage to bring this sort of success, if they do manage to bring down NHS waiting lists, if they do manage to improve the economy, are they still lost anyway, or could they, through their PowerPoint narrative, win back?
No, absolutely not. I mean, you've got to remember, it's 4 years till the next election. So the next election will be held, notionally at least, after Donald Trump has left office. And God alone knows what damage he'll wreak in the period before he leaves office. I mean, we don't know what sort of world we'll be living in. But so much can change over the next 3 or 4 years that I think people who are writing Labour off already are frankly just being a bit silly. And I think, there are two key things. Yes, messaging matters, but I think people feeling progress in their day-to-day lives is more important. I think, having a good experience at the NHS is worth, 50 party political broadcasts. So I think it's partly about actually delivering. You're right. The Labour, Keir Starmer hasn't got the charisma of a Nigel Farage. Maybe he doesn't have that knack of sounding like he's talking to the man in the pub. But what I would say is, on the one key metric that tends to matter, Keir Starmer is ahead of all his rivals. So that's Kevin Badenoch, Nigel Farage, you name it, in terms of who will make the best prime minister. So there is a sense amongst the British people that Keir Starmer is the most prime ministerial out of all of them. And what we don't know is what happens to Nigel Farage in an election where people might think there's a genuine chance of him winning. How many people will actually think, yeah, I can see Nigel Farage in number 10?
Yeah, so maybe we could see that Farage would no longer be seen as a protest vote. Maybe we'll see people might think he is prime ministerial material. I think it's way too early to predict that. But so do you think Labour does need a shift in messaging if they manage to bring success? Do they need a shift in messaging, or is their current narrative fine?
I think they need a narrative. I mean, I think, what this government lacks is a story. And it doesn't compel us with an idea of this is where we are, but this is where we're going to take you. And I think one of the problems with that is all the individual decisions over which they've struggled, whether it's over sort of winter fuel payments or over non-doms or whatever it might be. There's no overarching narrative you can slot that into. So I think people struggle to figure out what this government is for. What is, and actually simply saying I'm going to fix stuff by being competent isn't a convincing political story. And politics is about two things. It's about being competent. We shouldn't forget that. I mean, you can be the best storyteller in the world, but if you don't know what you're doing, that's rubbish. But equally, I think it's about being able to tell a tale, to tell a story, to bring people with you. And I think on that second thing, at least, Labour so far haven't been great.
Right. So do they need to be bolder in that sense? I've got a quote here. You've said that everything is done in the sort of defensive crouch. It's kind of apologetic. Do Labour need to start being bolder?
I think, having a story to tell means that you can slot what you're doing into the context of that story. Now, I mean, I might personally, if I were Prime Minister for a day, there might be things that I wanted to do. There are big structural problems facing this country. And my fear is that, given the fragmentation of our electorate, this might be the last time we see a majority of this size in this country. And I almost fear that the worst of all worlds is to get to the end of 5 years, look back and think, oh, God, we shouldn't have been so cautious, which is a bit what Blair did. Because I think, the consensus amongst people who were part of New Labour is they were far too cautious in their first term. As it happened, they had a second term with a big majority to start doing stuff. So in a sense, it wasn't that damaging.
Okay, so I see here your sort of core premise is that the reason for disillusionment has been failure, just most centrally a failure from mainstream parties to deliver economic growth, to deliver prosperity. How about around Europe? We've seen the rise of very right-wing parties in Italy, where we currently have a very right-wing prime minister in Italy, around Hungary just before, and then right now Poland. They've had a very right-wing head of state coming. So is the same solution for Europe, for the mainstream parties, for the main centrist parties to start delivering, or do they have different problems?
I mean, look, on the one hand, the problem of growth is a problem across Europe. German public services are in a mess. German infrastructure is in a mess, though Germany has the luxury of having some cash to spend. The French economy hasn't been firing particularly well. So, yes, but we've got to be careful. I think some of the specific problems faced by the post-communist countries, Poland and Hungary, are very different to some of the problems facing Western European countries. But I think, you can identify a lot of similar themes, dissatisfaction of younger voters. I mean, that's one of the curious paradoxes is in continental Europe, you are getting a significant rise in the number of young people willing to vote for populist right-wing parties. We haven't really seen that in the UK yet. So that's one of the things to watch. Geert Wilders is immensely popular among young voters. Nigel Farage isn't immensely popular amongst young voters. I mean, there's some evidence that his popularity is ticking up and his success on platforms like TikTok speak to that. So there are structural similarities in terms of difficulties generating growth, in terms of dissatisfaction with mainstream parties, which seem unable to deal with the kind of problems we face, in terms of centre-left parties struggling because they're being squeezed from both right and left, which is something we're starting to see with the Labour Party here. But I think, there are also very contingent, specific, contextual factors in each country that separate them.
Right. And you mentioned immigration as one of the key focuses of a reform voter. It's one of the main things they care about, really, in their sort of hierarchy of voting and caring about things. But from what I understand, immigration, the sort of impact it has on the economy, it normally does act on economic growth. There is a debate, whether there is a true net benefit to immigration. Regardless, I think immigration is quite a smaller part of the whole economic picture. So if reform voters are voting for reform because they care about immigration, does that mean that no matter what Labour does, they can't win them back? As you said, is that set in stone now? They can't win them back because...
I think it's very hard to win back people who are committed reform supporters, because they tend to be committed reform supporters because they think a plague on all your houses about mainstream politics. I mean, the key voters for Labour to think about are those voters who are perhaps people who voted Labour in 2024 and are now thinking, oh, this isn't going so well, maybe next time I'll vote reform. And I think potential reform switchers are very different people to reform voters. In terms of their preferences, they might not rank immigration quite as highly. So I think, political strategists need to be quite careful in delineating between the people who are, if you like, lost and the people you're in danger of losing.
So has the anger against immigration not changed then at all over the last few years?
It's changed a lot. I mean, what we've seen post-referendum is concern about immigration went down, support for immigration went up. And it's only really since, I think, Rishi Sunak started talking a lot about small boats as Prime Minister, the salience of immigration has come up again. And now we've just found in the latest Ipsos polling that immigration is the most important issue for the British public. So it's gone down, it's come up again. it's a complicated story as to why it's come up. I suspect having all the major parties talking about it. I mean, this is the interesting thing about Labour's strategy. Talking tough on immigration raises the salience of immigration. Whether it helps Labour, I'm not so sure. Because, as far as I can see, if we go into the next election with immigration being the top issue, there's only one person that helps, and that's Nigel Farage.
Right. So, almost trying to tackle immigration as a policy is helping Farage in some sort of sense.
Well, I think so. And I think actually some of the concern, maybe not all the concern, there's different concerns about immigration. They all get bundled together. A lot of people are concerned about small boats. That's very different to the question of how many people are getting visas to come and work here. But it all gets bundled together in a lot of lazy public debate that doesn't sort of separate out these various strands. Now, what you can do about small boats is very different to what you can do about visas. What you were saying earlier about economic growth, you're quite right, is all the evidence is, if the OBR thinks we're going to see a significant fall in immigration, it will revise its growth forecast downwards. Okay. That creates problems for the Chancellor in terms of fiscal headroom. Now, there is a debate that is raging about whether or not per capita GDP goes up or down as a result of immigration, whether or not we are sufficiently taking immigration, the impact of immigrants over their full lifetime, because of course at a certain point they too will stop working and rely on the welfare state. And the evidence is complicated on that. There is some slight evidence, I think, that overall immigrants still have a net positive effect. But I think one of the problems is all these different things get mixed up with each other. When you start talking specifics, what's quite interesting is if you say to people, should we reduce immigration? A lot of people say yes. If you say, okay, so would you rather have fewer care workers, fewer international students, fewer professionals? In general, they can't decide who they want to get rid of.
Right. So, and you mentioned small boat crossings there, and you said it's a sort of mixture that's been lazily bundled into one big heading of sort of immigration. I myself have seen a lot of anger online around small boat crossings. Is that a major part of the immigration, or is it smaller than?
I think for people who are concerned about immigration, small boats is a significant part of it. I mean, what I would say is, it is very hard seeing anger online to get a grip about just how widespread it is.
Right. And so small boats crossings, if it doesn't really impact, the economic story, NHS waiting list, because it's such a small number coming across the channel, is the problem then?
It has a significant impact simply because we're not processing people fast enough, which means we're paying a colossal bill to put people in hotels at the moment.
Oh, right. So, and is there anything Labour can do to address?
They've said it already that they're going to speed up the processing. Rachel Reeves, I think I'm right in saying, in the spending review speech, said we are going to stop using hotels to house asylum seekers. Now, I think one of the key ways of doing that is to make sure that you're on top of the processing so that you don't have a massive backlog of people waiting for their claims to be processed.
Right. And if as a core sort of policy point, if Labour is successful in this and reform loses this sort of point of contention among voters, then what would reform have to do?
Well, I personally find it very hard to see how you stop the small boats. The biggest determinant at the moment seems to be not government policy, but weather. So we have good weather over summer, the numbers will go up and we'll get more people coming. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you look at the world we're in at the moment, you look at what's happening in Iran. You're getting a load of refugees coming out of northern Iran going into Turkey. Where are they going to end up? They're going to end up in Europe, a lot of them, or they're going to try to come to Europe, a lot of them. So given global instability, given climate change, given a whole host of things, the notion that fewer people are going to be fleeing strikes me as fanciful. Then we have the problem about what you do about it. I think, you can do something about the cost by dealing with applications more quickly. Whether you can do anything about those sort of videos of people coming across the channel in dinghies, I'm less certain about.
So should just Labour just let the matter go of trying to convey their messaging on the matter, since, perhaps small boats crossings will not be coming down. Their processing may start increasing, and there may be less cost to it. But I think Farage will still have that sort of fuel.
I think it's very hard for any government to turn around, having made all these pledges about, all right, Labour haven't said stop the boats. That was soon. They say smash the gangs. It is very hard for a politician to stand up and say, look, I'm not sure we've got the answer to this problem. So I don't think that's necessarily a vote winner. But I think, if Labour were unwise enough to listen to me, I would say that actually you need a narrative that is one that isn't focused around immigration, because on that you're always going to lose.
Yeah, so stop putting the spotlight on immigration, or at least small boats crossings, since it's a battle. There's no way to win against Farage on that.
Yeah.
And we've been talking a lot about policy and messaging. Which specific policy areas offer the biggest opportunity for Labour to show that they understand the concerns that people have when they are voting for reform, and to be able to, as you said, maybe win some of the voters that aren't voting anymore, the voters that are voting for the Greens or Lib Dems? What specific policy areas show a true opportunity for Starmer?
I mean, I think, again, it is to actually generate growth. That is the most obvious thing. I mean, I think the keys to a second term in number 10 lie via the economy and making progress on the economy. And I think, Keir Starmer, I mean, this is where you get a slight muddling, isn't it? Keir Starmer keeps saying growth is my single most important priority, but then he says we're going to reduce immigration. And of course, that will impact negatively on growth. Now, obviously, there are trade-offs around being in government, but I think, ultimately, from where I see it now, and again, there's a long way to go. We don't know what sort of world we're going to be living in when we come to the next election. Labour need to show that they are making progress with the economy. Yeah. That the country is in a better state in 2008-9 than it was in 2004.
Right. So, the biggest thing that we're working on this video, the conclusion, we're still split in the team on what the true, what initiatives Labour must have. I'm personally a fan of long-term, as you said, tangible delivery. And I understand that you're on the camp of long-term tangible delivery, as opposed to perhaps headline-grabbing initiatives such as trying to combat immigration. Am I right in saying that?
Long-term delivery is fine, but they need to be showing that long-term delivery is bearing some fruits before we go to the polls again in 2029. It's all very well. I mean, yeah, a lot of the problems we face require long-term solutions. There's no doubt about that. One of the things where I think Labour will come under pressure is these so-called fiscal rules, whether or not they decide that they're not quite so ironclad, which seems unlikely, but that would give them more space to do the kinds of investment they've been talking about, which is one way to stimulate growth. Obviously, I mean, the other thing to be aware of is a lot of the things that impact on our economy are utterly out of our control. If, heaven forbid, the Straits of Hormuz are blocked, that's going to have a massive impact on prices and inflation in this country. It's not anything that this country can do anything about. The Ukraine war came out of nowhere, had a massive short-term impact on our economy. Donald Trump's tariffs are having an impact on our economy. So, it's a very difficult situation in which to be in power.
Right. Thank you, Professor. And just finally, last thing, it's a bit of a off-topic question, but do you think Trump's presidency is going to impact right-wing parties here in the UK and Europe?
It is impacting on right-wing parties here in Europe, but in many different ways. Donald Trump is very unpopular in the United Kingdom. I don't think saying you're a great friend of Donald Trump is necessarily a vote winner here. In other countries, the evidence is mixed, isn't it? He certainly gave the AfD, Elon Musk certainly gave the AfD a bit more profile, though I think their vote share dropped slightly from where they were in the polls before he intervened to where they were in the election afterwards. Now, whether that's because of Elon Musk or not, I don't know. What's certainly the case is Musk's intervention didn't lead to a sudden surge in support for the AfD. So I think, being seen on the world stage with being listened to by Donald Trump is going to help you look like a leader. Cozying up too much to MAGA or to Elon Musk, I'm not so sure that's necessarily going to help you politically in Europe.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for it's a very, very enlightening, really, discussion. Thank you very much. That's what I think. That's what I think we really covered some great topics there.